Welcome to DrJLT Economics. I personally think that we can find a lot of things in cycles. Economies boom and bust, technologies develop and decline, and civilizations rise and fall. In today's podcast, I want to really discuss a little bit the rise, to a lesser extent, and perhaps more importantly, the fall of the German automotive industry. This has been a long time coming. I think it is my view that Germany really developed in the 19th century after its unification and in the 20th century. And this was coincidentally a period when mechanical engineering really developed across the world, and Germany was, and to a large extent still is, at the forefront of this area. And with the strength of the know-how, the knowledge in mechanical engineering, the Germans were able to rise out of the rubbles of World War II very quickly, and a key industry in Germany for the last 7 decades has been its automotive industry. It is my observation that some of their biggest advantages have been in the engineering of internal combustion engines, particularly petrol engines, and the engineering of chassis and suspension. But at the same time, they aren't so good in electronics. This, on the other hand, is the strength of Germany's former ally, the Japanese. They developed their industries primarily after the war. I think this was the period of the electronics. It was the electronics age, and the Germans and the Japanese were able to really contribute with a lot of electronics companies, which now have become household names. And the Japanese auto industry, in the beginning, after the war, they have been, they were really backward. And of course, one of the first of their exports were ridiculed as low quality, perhaps even jokes. But they were good students. They learned from the best, from the Germans, and they improved on the mechanical engineering aspects in a lot of areas, and they were able to add a lot of electronic controls into the running of their automobiles. And in the end, by the 80s, they were able to manufacture a lot of vehicles that were highly competitive, not just in price, but also in the soundness of their mechanicals, and on top of that, with the added advantage of their electronic controls. This posed a big challenge to the Germans. In the beginning, it was small, and they were able to make some adjustments, cut some costs, and they were able to cope. But of course, in this period, they made some companies, namely best known, I would say, Mercedes, made some mistakes with their M137 engine that had a lot of problems that they developed. It was a V12 naturally aspirated petrol engine that they developed. Undoubtedly, after hundreds of millions, if not billions, in R&D cost, they had to discontinue it after just 2 years of production because the engine was so unreliable, and they would just blow up randomly. And of course, Mercedes also had their troubled eras with lots of rust, lots of electronic problems when they were forced to install a lot of systems into their cars that they were not really, I would guess, in hindsight, be so comfortable in placing in. And particularly thinking about the W220, the C215 generation of S-Class and CL-Class vehicles. Those were their flagship, by the way. But the Germans were able to still cope with this, with the attack of the Japanese by cutting costs, cutting corners here and there. We know a lot of engines that were built by the Germans that have that were basically simplified versions of prior engines. For example, the M113 engine and I think 112 didn't have oil pressure sensors, and they didn't have oil strainers, so that was good cost cutting. So that if any debris gets into the oil pan, the engine will just blow up. Well, that was the cost that they had to cut to stay competitive. And to a large extent, they stayed competitive. And one thing that the Germans, in my judgment, realized was that they could leverage their brand equity. And they can really push it a bit further than they used to. And by doing so, they actually regained a lot of the market shares vis-a-vis the Japanese globally. And this was a period when the Germans really started to pumping out all sorts of models. From BMW, for example, there used to be just 2 cars, 3 cars, but then now you can count from 1 to 8 and add an X in front of it and add an M in front of it, and you get all the cars, their entire portfolio. And similar things happened elsewhere in the German automotive industry as well. So one thing, of course, we know, and a lot of people who have been in business know, that the Germans are very good at marketing. This is not new to them. This was a trait that they have had for hundreds of years, for centuries. So they're very good at marketing, and so they were able to push this on, even though they were cutting costs, right? And even though the gap between them and the Japanese, and now, in fact, also the Koreans, in terms of chassis and suspension, and to a lesser extent, in terms of powertrains, not so much. In fact, one would argue that Lexus had better engines, and you could argue that the suspension advantage of the Germans are not so obvious today, especially since the Germans are also moving to less expensive suspension options, namely McPherson struts on a lot of the cars that formerly used multi-link suspensions. But that was a bit of a digression, and I don't want to really go there too much. This is the second time I record this podcast, because I was going on too much of a tangent, discussing on this issue, which, by the way, I'm very interested in, but I guess That's really not the topic today. The topic today is that currently, and not just the assault of foreign automakers, but also the clamp down of this global climate regulation, this climate-related regulations. The Germans are really electrifying their vehicles like never before. Mercedes introduced, I can't count, is it 5 or was it 8 electric vehicles last year? One uglier than the next, I have to add. And so is all the other German automakers. This, of course, is besides they're really rolling out of this hybridization, plug-in hybrids. In the 2022 model year, I just saw today that a lot of vehicles that used to be available with V12s and V8s, I'm talking about, you can think of this as some of the flagship marks by coming out of Germany. They're now available only with 4-cylinder diesels or plug-in hybrids. Nothing else. At least in EU stand, right? And I think this is really going to be a big problem. I do not think the Germans will be able to overcome this challenge as easily as they did the last time. The challenge from the foreign automakers. The reason is that they are not very good at making electronics. What the Germans are doing is essentially abandoning what they have been good at and instead betting on things that they have been proven to be worse at. This is on strategy terms, in strategy terms, this is basically a very foolish, that would put it mildly, move. Right? You always want to leverage. You see, there's this old saying from the art of war, which is that if you know yourself and you know your enemy, you need not fear 1,000 battles, right? The Germans, I don't know if they know about their themselves. Perhaps they think that they are very good at electronics, and perhaps they think that the Japanese, the Koreans, and even the Chinese are very bad at making electronics. Perhaps that's what they think. Perhaps they think that the Chinese are very good at making engines, internal combustion engines, and chassis and suspension. So they need to avoid this, right? This is on a strategic level just ridiculously stupid. I cannot put it in any other way, on any other terms. You want to leverage your strength, not to avoid it. You want to avoid your opponent's strength. You don't want to fight there. Right? But this is exactly what the Germans have decided that the path that they want to follow, and I do not see a good end for them, for this reason, right? And I think another thing you may say, okay, they are actually stuck between a rock, the proverbial rock and hard place, because on the one hand, perhaps they're not very good at making electronics, and by the way, they are not making any batteries. They need to import it from Asia. Let's not talk about that. But there are regulators who are forcing all these emission standards, all these electric vehicle goals, well, all I have to say here is that, number one, a complete conversion to electric cars is really a worse future than the future than the present. Why? Because even though electric cars don't have emissions at the pipe, they have a lot. The manufacturing process of all the battery packs involve a lot of environmental destruction. That is never a good thing. You do not fight climate change by destroying the environment, by polluting the planets with heavy metals. That is a ridiculous approach to a problem that can be addressed by other means. So, who is exactly driving this EV thing? Well, part of it is our interests who have invested in electric vehicles. And we have seen with the rise of the TSLA on the Nasdaq, there are a lot of hedge fund and other type of funds who have purchased an inordinate amount of Tesla stocks. But I'm pretty sure this is going to end. This is not going to end well for people. Just like I don't think it's going to end well for like Kathy Woods. The person was person of the year, investor of the year a couple of years ago. I think just in 5 years, this person will be banned from the street. The name will be so bad. So there's so much negative connotation with it. This is peak bubble. At the peak of the bubble, there are a lot of investors who are rather powerful, and they have invested in basically just Tesla. I don't think it's really other car companies, and they were pushing for electric vehicles. And this is really exactly like the push for certain medical treatments in the Western so-called quote-unquote liberal democracies. They want to push for a certain type of medical treatment that are offered by special interest groups, the big pharmaceutical companies, but they want to silence other proven treatments, including using generics or using other sort of medications that are manufactured not by these special interest groups, perhaps in foreign countries. They want to really separate this. There is no difference. In my judgment, there is no difference. The only reason that there is this strong push for EVs, battery electric vehicles, is because of the special interest and the worst corporate. One thing that ties them together is TSLA. And by the same time, I think, if I'm not too mistaken, I think within the next couple of years, 5 years at most, perhaps even this year, Nasdaq is going to crash, a la 1920, I think it was 27. Not entirely certain. I need to actually do better on history. But it's going to really crash. And after this crash, the people who have purchased, who are now holding TSLA, will no longer be holding TSLA. And I don't think that the push for electric vehicles will be so strong. Now, I'm not belittling the environmental issues that we're facing today. And I think there is a German manufacturer, automaker. I think Porsche is doing this. They are finding ways to capture carbon, to make renewable fuels to put into cars. And if this technology becomes mature, what happens is that you can have cars that burns this type of renewable fuels, and because this fuels is captured carbon, you're never really emitting, you're not adding carbon, you're not burning fossil fuel, you're not adding carbon into the environment, so you can actually achieve a balance, and you will not add to this anthropogenic climate change. That, I think, is a much more rational solution. To mine a lot of heavy metals, to pollute a lot of otherwise good land that could be used for farming, to feed people, all in the name of profit. Well, that is just on par with in a capitalist society. So I'm just like the push for medications. We need to be somewhat, some clear in our head that there is this profit motive. I'm certain that for battery electric vehicles there is big, huge profit motive, and it's going to do worse for the climate, for the environment than otherwise. And one of the sacrifices, one of the victims of this move, of this push, is Germany's automotive industry. If they continue on this path of fighting battles where they are the weakest, I don't see a lot of German makers at the scale that they are at today in 2 decades, or maybe simply just a decade's time, because they will be pushing out a lot of electric vehicles, which are really generic. Because what is so different between one electric powertrain and another electric powertrain? And electric motors, it is not so difficult to stuff a bigger electric motor into a car, right? A lot of people would refuse to purchase electric vehicles because it just does not fit their needs. They need to charge. They don't want to charge all the time just to charge 24 hours just to drive a few hours. That may not be practical to a lot of people. And a lot of regions, even though now they want to virtue signal, they want to say that we care about the climate, we care about the environment, want to encourage people to adopt EVs. When they realize that they don't have the electric grid to handle this, to handle this, the electrification of automobiles, they will not be so accommodating. And so I think this really is a big strategic mistake by a lot of the German automakers. The worst among them, I'm afraid, is actually Mercedes. It's betting so much on electric vehicles. I cannot believe it. But anyways, this is my personal opinion. Obviously, I'm only talking about an industry that I'm not really working in, but I think some of the economic principles and a lot of the experience that any acute observer should be able to accumulate over time do lend some credence to my commentary. And of course, if you disagree with me, please leave a comment. And of course, if you do agree with me, you can also, of course, leave a comment if you like. And give this video a thumbs up. And if you want to subscribe to my channel, I will periodically make some videos making similar comments about the industries, the economics, and a lot of the business policies in major economies. Thanks, and have a great day.